bokeh, the final frontier, or something. I don't know. F1.2 is normally reserved for the high-class photo and videographers who wish to spend literally thousands of dollars for a single lens that produces images that, well, I mean, I can't tell the difference between them. But for those seeking the exclusivity and prestige of F1.2, well, I have something to show you. An F1.2 lens for less than $200. A Canon FL 55mm F1.2. So this is a Canon FL lens. It was released in the 60s. It has a minimum focusing distance of about 0.6 meters, a 58mm filter thread, 8 aperture blades, and 7 elements in 5 groups. It is also just really beautifully and well constructed. I got mine for about $190, and it arrived in nearly pristine condition considering the age. These FL lenses were built really well, usually completely metal. This one especially. I will say though, the lens mount on these FL lenses is pretty unintuitive by today's standards though. It still uses the Canon FD mount, but the mount itself is just really unintuitive and it makes quick lens changes a bit of a pain. But I mean, it does work and the lens doesn't fall off. It's just kind of a weird little thing. I don't know. Either way, focusing is really nice. If a bit stiff, but this lens most likely needs to be re-lubed, so I'm just not going to hold that against it. The aperture is also a clicked aperture, which is my personal preference. It is a bit odd though because you adjust the aperture in the front, kind of like a Helios 44-2, but you don't have the aperture preview. You just have a clicked aperture out front, but I don't mind that too much. It also has a 58mm filter thread, which is pretty standard, so you should be able to easily find a filter that you can just slap onto the front of the sky. And speaking of filters, the front element does not rotate as you focus, so you don't have to worry about variable NDs or polarizers getting all screwed up from rotating lens assemblies or whatever. Now, that's all good and great. If you want to save $1,000 on an f1.2 lens, then here you go. Kinda. I'm gonna be honest. This is honestly the first lens I've ever reviewed where I just couldn't find a use for me personally. I've had lenses where I just wasn't really the biggest fan or thought it was more of an entry into a certain style of photography, like the Sigma 10-20. I mean, let's look at the sharpness. So, oh hey look, I splurged $10 on a cheap sharpness chart. How about that? At f1.2, this lens is unsurprisingly about as sharp as the $200 chef's knife your in-laws put in the dishwasher over Thanksgiving, especially in the corners. Vignetting is also absolutely terrible, but once you stop it down to f1.4, there is a decent increase in sharpness in the center, but not so much in the corners, and slightly better vignetting. In f2, you get another solid bump in sharpness, this time mostly in the corners, and once you drop down to f5.6, you get another really solid bump in sharpness for the corners, leading to an actually pretty sharp image for a vintage lens around the whole frame. For comparison, this is my Canon 50mm f2.5 macro at f5.6 for comparison, and then a Canon 28-70 f2.8 at f5.6. Stopping down more from this doesn't seem to do a whole lot in terms of image quality. f8 is a slight increase and clears up the corners a little more. Same for f16, which is going to be the minimum aperture for this lens. So this lens isn't very sharp, and I know, we expected that, I can already hear you saying. But this lens is about character and the low light for a cheap price. And at night, there is just an insane amount of coma around points of light. And bokeh, for some reason, just gets really messy really fast in certain situations. At f1.2, with cleaner backgrounds during the day, the bokeh is actually pretty nice. Not amazing, but it's pleasing. But if your goal is to have those individual bokeh balls that don't blend together, you can get some really interesting and unique images. And if it is daytime and your background isn't super busy, the bokeh is actually pretty pleasing to look at for me. It's usually just the bright points of light that end up muddying it. Besides bokeh though, this lens does have a personality, who would have thought? This lens has a really distinct look and this kind of weird mild green hue I've noticed. It's easily fixed in post, but I figured I'd mention it. And the images have a ton of contrast, which almost makes up for the lack of sharpness wide open. It also has really pleasing colors that they're not really ideal in all situations, but I liked them for what I was using the lens for. And while it doesn't have the same bright, vibrant, contrasty look certain Minoltas, like the Minolta MD, I believe 50mm 1.4, that's really just up to your preference, honestly. And overall, given the right conditions, this lens does make some really beautiful images that has this specific tone I really can't describe. And honestly, I bet this lens would really shine on a proper film camera with some nice, film grain. Oddly enough, I actually like this lens more for video than I did for photos. It obviously doesn't have any form of autofocus and definitely has no stabilization, auto aperture, any of that. It does, though, have a lot of character. So if you do have a certain look you're trying to achieve, this lens could fit the bill. Wide open, it has a very soft, kind of dreamy look without any swirly bokeh that I could see a lot of people liking. It also has some really crazy flaring. If you're shooting at night with something like a candle as a light source, you can actually do it. You can use a candle as a light source. But if the candle is too close to you, it just completely blows out the entire image with these giant crazy flares. If it is a little further away, it can somewhat work. I could see this getting really annoying if you're not actively trying for those lens flares, especially during the day. If you try and shoot later in the day and the sun happens to be existing at that point in the day, it'll blow out your entire image. It's insane. But I will say for video work, the focus ring is really nice. The throw is awesome. It's nice, it's big, smooth to turn, and the lens has a lot of weight to it, which can help with some stabilization. So if you do need something for low light video and you do have a specific plan for this lens, I could see it working out really well for you. If you plan ahead, avoid bright points of light in your frame or try to mitigate it in some way, or if you just want to record video of stars on a budget, that could work too. I know it sounds like I'm hating on the lens. I'm really not. I can for sure see people needing the extra light, especially if you're shooting on film. If you're shooting on film, I think this is almost an essential lens if you are shooting on like an old Canon film camera. But I also don't want people to see a cheap f1.2 lens and immediately decide to spend, $200 over it instead of spending $50 on an f1.4 lens. Just because bigger, smaller, wider number or whatever. And then just get dissuaded from more vintage lenses because they had one bad experience with a lens that happened to have some more characteristics they might not necessarily like. And at the end of the day, it's a vintage lens, and it's a cheap one at that. It's going to have a lot of character, and there's going to be a ton of people that really love the character this lens has, and there are going to be a ton of people that aren't the biggest fan. I actually really like it. I currently don't really plan on selling it because it does have this unique look I really, really like in very certain situations. If you can deal with a little bit of funky business from a vintage lens, then I think this is a solid buy. If you don't want any funky business, just get a 51.4, live your life. Don't worry about the extra 0.2, if that even makes sense in aperture terms. I don't know.